You know, people might not think of a paper bag or newspaper or something like that as a mulch. It is a mulch, right? It's basically wood chips, right? It came from a tree and it's biodegradable, and it'll break down. It's going to go in one, and at some point in time this paper is going to go through one end of a worm and out the other. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I recently got a good viewer question and just an idea I've had for a video recently, so I thought I'd make a video about this. And this is, growing things in mulched beds. Garden beds that are mulched all the time. And, how do we get different things to grow in them? Should we take it off? Should we push it aside? Should we put it back on? How to think about all of that. So, generally speaking, you should keep all your beds covered all the time as much as possible. That is to say, don't let your soil become bare, right? As long as your soil is covered with a mulch of some kind, there is activity going on right at that layer where the mulch meets the soil of the soil organisms, right? They're busy working on that decaying plant matter, and their activity results in nutrients becoming available to your plants. So you want to have all your soil covered all the time, to as much of an extent as that's possible, because it facilitates the activity of those soil organisms, and the result of the activity of those soil organisms is more nutrients being available to your plants, the soil being maintained in a sort of loose, but not too loose, the ideal sort of soil composition, loose but not too loose sort of thing, the right amount of air spaces in the soil, the right combination of compost, loam, and that sort of stuff. So bearing all of that in mind, let's talk about 4 different kinds of plants that you might want to have growing in your food garden. Number 1 is the perennial, whether that's a tree or a berry bush or something that dies back every year but comes up through the ground, like a rhubarb, right? Things like that, lovage, rhubarb. There's lots of things like that they die down to the ground but they come back. A lot of herbs can be like that, right? They'll die back but they'll come back the next year. So for those, so that's 1, the perennial. Number 2 is a garden bed that you're going to be transplanting in, right? You're going to be plugging something into it, whether you've started the transplant indoors in some sort of artificial condition inside your house, or a nice big bow window, or you bought the transplant from a garden center, or if, like me, you actually start your transplants outdoors, whether you're doing that under a hoop house or a row cover or a mini greenhouse or an actual full-size greenhouse. But basically you've got a transplant and you're going to plug it into the soil. That's another situation. And then you've got the plants with large seeds that make up a lot of foliage, take up a lot of space, plants with large seeds, generally speaking. And then you get the plants with the small seeds that are sort of a different category unto themselves. So number 1, the perennial. Well, if it's a perennial garden, it should just be mulched all the time, no matter what. Right? Every fall, put about 3-4 inches of something. I like to use yard waste, but just use whatever you can get. Some sort of mulch. Keep that soil covered all the time. That'll keep the soil organisms happy, and that'll keep your perennial happy. Period. Whatever the perennial is. So that one's done. If it's a perennial, or if it's a bed you're going to transplant stuff into, again, keep it mulched all the time. And when you're ready to plug your transplant into the soil, just move the mulch aside, stick your transplant in the soil, and then put the mulch back. Period, right? Think of that mulch like a blanket that keeps everything in the soil happy while simultaneously feeding, fertilizing the soil and maintaining the moisture levels, right? So you got this nice mulch blanket. So keep everything mulched all the time with the transplant bed. So if you're going to put tomatoes into a bed or something like that, and when it's time to plant the tomatoes, just move the mulch aside, stick the tomatoes in, and we'll move the mulch back around the stem of the tomato. If you're concerned that the mulch is preventing the soil from warming up You know, when you're putting certain kinds of transplants in the ground, you want the soil to be a certain temperature, because the roots of those plants cannot take a cold temperature. Tomatoes are a perfect example. Tomato, pepper, eggplant, all the things in that category, right? Then maybe you want to, you know, just put some clear plastic over the mulch to warm up the mulch and warm up the soil underneath it. If you're really concerned, move the mulch back a little bit and put whatever you're using to warm that up. A lot of people say black plastic, but I find clear plastic, it lets the sun through and lets the sun warm the soil up. So in my experience, clear plastic does a much better job of warming up the soil, especially if you expose the soil. So you can expose the soil for, let's say I got some transplants and I want to plant them. Well, you know, you can just move the mulch back a little bit where those transplants are going to go. Put some sort of, affect some sort of microclimate. I got many videos on how I do that here. I'm not going to go into it. You put some sort of plastic or window or something over that soil for just a few days, really. Once you're into, if you're planting a tomato, where I live, you're not going to be putting that in the ground until like May, late May, early June sort of thing. So yeah, it's relatively sunny, relatively warm that time of year. So maybe you want to warm the soil up a little bit, and then you plug the transplant in, then you move the mulch back around it. Okay. Now, big seeds like a pumpkin or squash or a cucumber is a relatively small seed, but it makes a big plant. Anything like that, it's relatively easy to plant something like that in the garden. Come have a look. I'll show you how to do that. All right. Now I've done videos on this in the past, but this one's more of a summary video. Here's a bed I've got garlic growing, and I actually just planted some onions. That's a spike vegetable, so that's, I guess, another category, but a spike plant. All I did when I planted the onions, I just took the onion sets, little tiny bulbs, and just screwed them into the ground. And after they've spent a couple days getting used to the situation here, they'll start to grow. Let's say I wanted to plant a pumpkin here, or a cucumber or something like that. I would just move this mulch back enough to make a circle like that, maybe a little bit wider, but maybe like your hand, right, that diameter. And I'd put maybe 3 squash seeds in there, pumpkin seeds. And once they're about this high, I'd pick the one that looks the healthiest and the strongest and just kill the other ones. And then I move the mulch back around and let it grow above the mulch. There's so many benefits the mulch gives the soil, aside from just decomposing and turning into compost and making the soil that beautiful black stuff, right, like I have here, beautiful black stuff, right? But also, when your squash or your pumpkin, whatever's growing, when that vegetable, fruit or whatever starts forming, instead of it sitting on the soil, it's sitting on this nice dry mulch. So it less likely to get problems. It's less likely that harmful insects might bore into it and all those sorts of things. Your plants would just do a lot better growing on top of a mulch like that, because they're the thing that you're actually producing, the cucumber, the squash, the tomato, whatever it is, it's going to sit on this nice dry stuff as opposed to sitting on this cold, damp stuff that's got, a range of things in it that might cause, damage to your vegetable. So any sort of big seed, any sort of big thing like that, you just move it back a little bit, get the thing in there. Once it's a good height, move the mulch back. That's it. Now, with small seeds, you got different kinds of options and different considerations. But generally speaking, it's a similar sort of approach. But like here, I've got, I believe I've planted parsnips here. Okay, so all I did was I sort of shaped the mulch into mounds. So I just moved it aside, sort of thing, right? Opened it up. So these mounds here are mounds of mulch that was here all winter. And I exposed the soil in between the mulch mounds and planted my seeds down these. Now you can run into problems, and I have this problem here, but it's not the end of the world, of having birds get in here and peck around. Like they're not after my parsnips. You know, I can't think of, at least where I live anyway, I don't have any birds that are trying to eat, you know, young seedling parsnips. They're poking in around here to get at worms and snails and slugs and whatever wildlife is in here. That's why the birds are here. And so every once in a while I'll notice a clump of grass down the middle like that, so I just move it off, right? And a little bit of stuff, a parsnip can get through that. I did an experiment one year where I threw parsnip seeds on the ground and put about 2 inches of seaweed over the seeds, and they found their way through it. So I mean, a relatively thin mulch, let's say half an inch or less, small seeds, whatever it is, lettuce, kale, that whole family of things that have seeds like kale seeds, like a tiny mustard seed, all those things can find their way through, half an inch of mulch, really, or half an inch, a centimeter sort of thing. For that matter, so can, pumpkins and other things like that. So you can, it doesn't matter. My point is that some of this stuff is going to blow into the middle where I've exposed the soil. You can tell here it's not just bare soil. There's a little bit of mulch here. That's not a big deal. If anything, that's good, because it just helps preserve the moisture levels in there that much more. But that'll happen. Don't worry, you don't want to have big clumps on there, but a little bit of this and that should be okay. And these parsnips should be growing any week now. Another approach is to do like I did here. This is the laziest way, but in my opinion, it's it's the worst way. So here's a garden where I planted, needs a watering actually, that I came out to do this morning. And I got the idea to make this video. But here's a garden where I planted, lettuce and spinach. And I sowed these seeds in like the tail end of March, under the plastic there, because it creates little micro, so, if this hadn't been covered in the plastic, nothing here would have germinated, right? The plastic is what facilitates the germination. So here we've got a bed where I just took all the mulch off and planted. You can see, here's a row of lettuce, here's a row of spinach, there's some weeds here. Here's a row of lettuce, here's a row of spinach. So my stuff's growing, and I've got some weeds here too. So the problem with removing all the mulch, on the good side, if you can put some plastic over it, because the soil is dark, it heats the thing up. I mean, sure, once these plants are a certain height, I'm gonna put mulch in here and mulch the whole bed. The problem with removing all of the mulch is that all of the soil is exposed to the light, and it's all gonna dry out periodically, right? It's not protected from the sun, sort of thing, right? So that's why it's good to have the mulch in between your rows, or some other thing, which I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So the two drawbacks of just scraping all the mulch off and planting, on the one side it's quick, right? Just scrape it all off, put it in a wheelbarrow, put it in a bag or something like that, and you're going to put it back on later on. But the drawback is that the exposed soil is drying out, right? Remember, your plant roots go down, and if you can keep the space between your rows from drying out, your plant roots can get into that soil that's underneath, whatever you've got it covered with, and that just benefits them that much more. So drying out is a problem. Another problem is that all your real estate here, whatever weed seeds are in there, are going to germinate. And sure, there's ways to, hot compost and right? But I mean, I just can't be bothered to do all of that. There's better ways to prevent weeds from happening in your garden. I do one garden as an example of, taking all the mulch off a year. There's a bit of work involved in dealing with these weeds. Not a huge deal, right? But it is some work. And some of these weeds are actually edible. People are always seem to be bent into shape when they see me pull an edible weed like this. What is this one? Plantain. They'll see me pull an edible weed and throw it off. I'm not going to eat that. Come on. I have to let that grow a lot more for that to be edible, and it would take up space where I'm trying to grow lettuce and spinach, which taste better. So anyway, there are some edible weeds I do grow. I noticed in this bed here I've got a bit of what's it called, this one here. So this is it's not coming to mind. Anyway, it's a wonderful edible weed from the amaranth family. I'll put the name up on the thing. I just can't, I'm not thinking of it right now, but it grows. There's another one there. It grows everywhere in my garden. I brought in a whole bunch of seaweed one year, and it had all kinds of this in it, right? That's what this one is. Why can't I remember what that's called? It's like goat something, or I can't remember now. Lamb's quarters, there we go. So it tastes just like spinach. My kids actually eat it right out of the garden. So I brought it in with a mulch, but it turns out it tastes good. So I actually do gather that. I gather whole bowls of it, and we do eat it, and we like it. I love it. So and it's the same family as spinach anyway. That's why it tastes like spinach. Anyway, that's one approach. I'm getting distracted here because I'm starting to eat things out of my garden, which is wonderful. So that's one approach. Just scrape all the mulch off and plant. But the soil dries out faster than it would if you just had a system like the one I showed you before, and you're just asking to have more weeds in your garden. There's another way for this small seed type deal. So here's a bed I planted way back, like middle of April or end of April. Yeah. And I got some spinach growing here. That's spinach there. I got some kale. Oh, it's been attacked by something. Got a lot of wild dill growing in here. And I've got some lettuce over there. Now, I don't really care too much about this bed. I'm going to grow potatoes here. I just started to grow some early things. I'm going to plant a late crop of potatoes, like June sort of thing. So I thought in the meantime, why not, get something growing in here. So, by some point in, early July or whatever, the spinach is done anyway. Anyway, what I've done here is I've left mulch around, but I've used this leaf bag paper. I just cut it up into strips. So what that does is, see, it's moist underneath there, right? It keeps the sun off the soil. There's always some bit of plant matter here, so there's still worm activity going on underneath here, but there's a lot of things that have germinated under this paper. I can see right here, dill, right? So there's a lot of weed seeds, because it's warm, because I've got that dome on, there's a lot of weed seeds germinating under the paper. But for the most part, they hit the paper and they rot and they die. So it just reduces your need to weed that much more. You see any weeds, you just pick them and throw them on top of the paper like that. But yeah, so that's another way to do it. Let me show you another example of that. Here's a bed where I planted some carrots. I can't remember, maybe a week ago, give or take, and I put this plastic on just to, this is like the plastic that a bed mattress comes in. So I put that on there. A lot of water is gathered in it. Anyway, I planted carrots here. They have not germinated yet, but because the plastic is so close to the soil, it hasn't dried off since the day I watered it. It's actually nice and warm. Some things have germinated here, but it would be obvious if the carrots had germinated, because there'd be a straight line of, plants that all look about the same. Anyway, what I've done here is I put newspaper down, or this is a leaf bag paper, but any kind of paper will work, even strips of cardboard. And then I put these rotten logs on top of the paper to keep it from moving around and blowing away and that sort of thing. So if you were going to do something like this and you weren't going to have it covered in any way and you're worried about the wind causing problems with your cardboard or your leaf bag paper, your newspaper, you put rocks on it. You can put soil on top of the cardboard. You can put just old rotten logs like this, pieces of lumber, really anything, right? Just to keep it from moving around. I think the day I sowed these, it was very windy, so I first time I ever did this, I just put them on because it was windy, and then I found I just left them on the whole season. Right, so once these carrots are, let's say, 6 inches high, I'll bring mulch in, and I'll cover all of this with the mulch, and I'll just leave all this stuff where it is. Right, I'll leave it all where it is. I won't take any of it out at all, and this stuff will all be just fine. It doesn't cause any problems at all, because underneath these, right, I mean, everything here is moist, right, but that's because the whole thing was basically like wrapped in plastic sort of thing, right? Yeah, this, and you ever go in the woods when you were a kid, you're looking for salamanders or worms or something like that, you turn a rock over and it's moist underneath the rock. That's the same effect you're causing here, right? The paper is going to be eaten by worms and other organisms. There's still plenty of things for the soil organisms to work on here, and we're going to be adding more mulch once the plants are a certain height, so we're going to continue to feed the soil. This is just one more way to sow in a mulched bed, or a bed you're about to mulch, without exposing all of the soil, right? And a good way to keep the soil from thawing out, or from drying out, and from drying out, while at the same time preventing the weeds. And remember, people might not think of a paper bag or newspaper or something like that as a mulch. It is a mulch, right? It's basically wood chips, right? It came from a tree, and it's biodegradable, and it'll break down. It's going to go in one, and at some point in time, this paper is going to go through one end of a worm and out the other, right? At some point in its decomposition, or in one end of some soil organism and out the other end, whether that's a fungi or a bacteria or a worm or something in between, right? So paper is a mulch. It breaks down, right? Okay. One more trick is to, you put so I can't remember what I planted here, some sort of perennial, I believe. Bloody dock. I think it's a perennial called bloody dock. So that's a fairly large, it's going to have like a hosta-like shape. It's like a floret. So it's a relatively small seed, but it's a large plant. So I don't need to open up a row. I put paper here to keep any of the weed seeds from germinating, and I just cut holes in the paper. And I put about 4 or 5 seeds in each of these holes. Once they germinate, I'll pick the ones that look the best and let them grow. And once they're about 6 inches high, I'll just cover all of this with the mulch. So that's another way to sow in a mulched bed while avoiding weeds and that sort of thing. Actually, I can see the birds have been working away here, making a mess of things. That's all right. Happy to share my garden with robins. I guess since I didn't mention it, I guess there is a 5th category, I suppose, and that is things like garlic. A thing you plant in the fall that grows the following spring. That's what garlic does. So I treat that the same way I would treat a perennial, right? Same sort of category. It's got a big bulb like a tulip or anything like that. It's got a big bulb. It's got lots of energy in that bulb. It'll push through. It'll get through just fine. I find if you got a loose kind of mulch like this, it'll get through, but you'll be surprised what garlic can push through. Let me show you a bed over here. People are always asking me what sort of mulch should I use. Now, this was a bed that I planted garlic in, and then I forgot that I had planted garlic in. And I dumped a whole bunch of yard waste and leaves. I mean, this mulch goes down. My God. I mean, yeah, in some places this mulch goes down about 5 inches. So I wouldn't recommend that. I would say 2 to 3 inches is ideal. But these garlic all found their way through it, and they're all growing, which is amazing. Some spots are shadier than others, but I mean, this one looks nice and strong and healthy by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, leaves, right? We got every kind of thing you can imagine here. We got grass, we got leaves, seaweed, right? Yeah, so garlic will just find its way through. So there we are. We got you know, four types of things with an asterisk. Perennials and garlic and things like garlic, Egyptian walking onions, I guess would fall in. There's a number of things like that. You plant them in the fall, they come back the following, they grow the following spring, and perennials. Transplants, things with big seeds or things with huge amounts of foliage, or things with small seeds with not the biggest sort of foliage that you'd want to plant in rows. There's certain things you just want to plant in rows, like carrots, parsnips, beets, things like that. Things you plant in rows with relatively small seeds, right? So with those things, you're basically exposing a strip of the soil until the plants are big enough for you to move the mulch back, right? Anything that becomes really big, all you really need to do is expose a small circle of the soil until they're a certain size, and you can close that circle in, right? For a transplant, you're just moving the mulch aside, plug it in, move the mulch back. And for a perennial, just keep a mulch. It'll all work itself out. That's the short version. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. Don't forget to click the bell if you want to be notified when I make new videos. And until next time, get out there, get at it, get your soil covered, and have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.